stuff come from.
All right, if everybody gather around, we'll go ahead and get started. We're a little late starting this stop, but some other folks may trickle in a little bit later. I would encourage everybody to grab a handout off of that post right there, because a lot of what I'm going to say is going to refer to that. There should be enough for everybody. And also we have the CCA sign-in sheet here. If anybody wants CCA credits, you can do that right here. Has everybody got a handout that wants one? All right, I'm actually going to flip over and I'm going to talk first on that second page that you see there, the slide that says seedling vigor. So most of you are familiar with the on-farm variety testing program that we have here in North Carolina, and Dr. Keith Edmondson and myself, we share cotton extension responsibilities, and he manages the OVT program, which has been around for years and years. And the on-farm program and OVT complement each other very, very well. The OVT program, for example, has upwards of about 60 variety entries in it, and that's the platform in which experimental varieties are tested before they come commercial. On farm, we have a lot more environments in all regions of the state, but we're really fine-tuned to look at the varieties that we know are competitive varieties, they're established varieties, and we ask that every company give us their top 2 on a broad basis that they say are the very best variety offerings that they have for us in North Carolina. So I'm not going to talk about yield results, you'll see that in the winter time. But while we have this program here, I think it's a good resource to utilize and gather and collect some other useful data that might give us some insight on how certain varieties need to be managed. And the first thing I want to talk about is seedling vigor, okay? Now, I don't have it in this handout, but seedling vigor can be very highly correlated to seed size. Now, there are some varieties with larger seed than other varieties, and we know that. But even within a single lot number of the same variety, you can still have a range in seed size. So basically, we're evaluating the lot numbers that were given to us for variety testing purposes, and you can see how they rank in terms of seedling vigor overall. Now, I've got the past 3 years of data illustrated here. There's a couple things you need to take into consideration. One is the varieties change from year to year, but you know, now we're about 4 or 5 varieties that overlap from year to year in this program. So from year to year, you can use those ones that have been in the trials longer to base decision on and gauge how some of the newer ones to the program rank or compare to something that we already know. Okay, basically, are they more vigorous or are they less vigorous? All right. So as varieties come onto the market these days, you know, we don't know much about them. They come on the market real quick and they leave real quick. So we're trying to gauge a lot of this as quick as we possibly can. So we gather this information in several environments. This particular year was 7 different environments. So we try to have a robust data set in each of these calculations. Now, what I will say is this probably should not influence variety decisions unless you have a particular field where soil type is just really tends to crust over, or for whatever reason, historically you have a field that is problematic at planting time year in, year out. All right. Outside of that, we can successfully grow and get any of these varieties established at planting. With that said, some need a little extra attention during planting time and certain considerations, okay? Now, everybody also knows in terms of seedling vigor that both warm and cool germ really matter, especially in a typical spring in North Carolina where we have some of both, and a lot of times we start the spring under cool conditions and get warmer as the season goes on. Heavy rains and packing rains, that can influence planting success as well. But we have found that seed size is a very good predictor of overall relative seeding vigor. In other words, how one variety compares to another. So some that you see on the far left of these charts, those are our larger seeded varieties. hence they're the most vigorous ones. They're more robust coming out of the ground. We can plant some of those in marginal conditions. Now, I'll never recommend planting in, conditions we know are very, very poor. But even in marginal conditions where it could go either way, we probably need to focus on some of these varieties to plant through that window until we get to better conditions. The ones you see on the far right, for example, those are our smaller seeded varieties, a little bit weaker coming out of the ground. Now, you'll recognize the names of some of them. Some of them are the most successful varieties we have in terms of yield, sometimes, okay? But they need a little extra attention during planting season. So the ones on the far right here, we need to be very careful about not planting those varieties too deep. We need to plant them in ideal conditions, if there is such a thing, when we have good temperatures and adequate soil moisture, and do everything we possibly can to get those seed out of the ground as quick as we can, okay? So over here on the left, those are a little bit more foolproof. They can tolerate a little bit more stress. So any questions about seedling vigor before we move on? All right, any comments from any of the seed companies? All right, so now flip back to the first page. So another thing we like to do using these on-farm variety trials is gauge in-season growth potential. And this gives us a little bit of insight on how some of the newer varieties might need to be managed with growth regulators. All right, it's the same kind of chart you saw before. The varieties change from year to year, although we do have some overlap from year to year. So use that on this chart to gauge how something brand new compares to something that is known and is a little more predictable. All right, that's why we show multiple years of data here. All right, so again, this probably shouldn't influence variety decisions in terms of yield, but this could tell you how some of these varieties need to be managed. The ones on the far left, those are the ones with the greatest growth potential. A lot of times they tend to be somewhat later maturing compared to some of the other ones that you see here. And especially in conditions like what we have here in this demonstration, where on this kind of soil where moisture is not likely to be limited. If anything, we worry about too much soil moisture sometimes. But that's where you got to start worrying about some of the ones with the greatest growth potential. It's when you have moisture season long, or adequate moisture season long. And again, we can manage all these. We just have to kind of know that going into it. So we need to be a little more aggressive with our growth regulators for the varieties on the far left. The ones on the far right, they tend to be very early maturing. They don't have the growth potential that some of these other ones have. They tend to start fruiting and develop a boll load very, very rapidly, and henceforth they'll reach cutout at a little bit earlier than some of the later varieties. But in general, they're just not likely to get as tall. Now, with that said, any variety we have on here can get too tall. And that's driven by the environment at that point. The environment plays a much, much greater role in the need for plant growth regulators than does the genetics. But it does help us to understand the variety genetics and the tendency it might have for its growth potential, okay? So if you flip over again, ultimately what we want to do is categorize varieties into one of these three categories, and that tells us how they should loosely be managed with growth regulators. All right, can everybody hear me okay? All right. So with that said, I want to make a few disclaimers. These are very, very general guidelines. This is not to be taken as gospel, okay? For the reason I just mentioned, the environment plays a much greater role in the need for PGRs than genetics. Some of the ones in this bottom category can get overhead high if conditions are right. Some of the ones in the top category can reach cutout at knee high and not grow anymore if we end up in real hot, dry conditions. And we've seen some of both this year. All right, but with that said, very loosely speaking, and again, these recommendations really apply to conditions where you're likely to have soil moisture season long. You introduce significant drought stress anytime during the season, and a lot of this falls apart. So just keep that in mind. But those there at the top Those are the varieties with the greatest growth potential, tend to be a little bit later maturing, therefore they need a little bit more aggressive PGR management. In soils like what we have here, we're probably going to start prior to first bloom, somewhere around 9-10 leaves. Then follow that up with a first bloom application, and if needed, maybe another one during mid bloom. The ones here in the middle can go either way sometimes. They're the hardest ones to wrap our minds around, in my opinion. All right, we may or may not start at first bloom. A lot of cases we can start at first bloom. One, maybe two applications at that point could be needed, depending on environmental conditions. And then there at the bottom, those are the varieties with the least growth potential, tend to be the very early maturing. They cut out a little quicker and a little more harsh, just not as likely to get way too tall. Fairly responsive to PGRs, fairly easy to manage. In these cases down here in that bottom category, there'll be a lot of times when you don't need a PGR at all, okay, especially on some of our sandier ground. Now with that said, if a PGR application is justified, we most commonly want to start that at first bloom. We rarely want to go out prior to first bloom on some of these down here because we can force them into a premature cutout, and we don't want to do that. So start at first bloom. A lot of times one application will do it, and a lot of times we can use either lower rates of standard mepiquat or something that's a little more forgiving like Stance or something like that. All right, you will see some varieties appear in more than one category. That's just because they're right on that line of falling into one or the other. And in some trials and in some years, they'll look more like the later maturing group, some years maybe not. Okay, so again, use this as very, very general guidelines. Any questions on this? All right, so for those of you who don't have a handout, there's some right on that post there if you want to follow along. All right, so there on the back, Dr. Edmondson and myself, and we've got several more on the cotton team. I mean, we're here to help you. That's what we're here to do. And we have a lot of resources there that I want to show you at the top. Most of you are familiar with the Cotton Portal website that we use. That's where all of our newsletters are posted. And there's a lot of other information on that same website. There's a link to that website there at the top. If you're not on our newsletter list, and I strongly encourage you to be so, make sure you get up with us before you walk to another stop, and we'll get your email added to our email list. Now, we're going to email it out every time we have we post a newsletter. You're also going to see it on our Facebook page, which is right here. All right, we have a group called North Carolina Cotton, and we're also going to send it out via Twitter. And there at the bottom, that's all of our Twitter handles. And collectively, if you want to follow all of us at one time, you can go to that NCSU space cotton, and that's a list, and that follows every one of us. So anytime any of us tweets anything, you'll see it posted under that list. Okay, so we strongly encourage you to check out some of these other resources like the variety calculator. That, you know, we'll use that in the wintertime. We're not going to talk much about it today. It's on our portal website, but that's the direct link to it if you want to go straight to it. And then the cotton planting conditions calculator, we launched that back this past winter, and that's been very successful as well. And that basically gives you a real-time planting recommendation for anywhere in North Carolina. All you have to do is click on the Google Map image, and it'll spit out the planting recommendations for the current day and the following 2 days at any given time throughout the season. Any questions on this stuff? All right, so we got plenty of time. I would encourage you, Dr. Edmondson's going to talk next, but after that, if we got time, which I'm sure we will, feel free to walk through the varieties. Now, this is a single rep demo that we have here. We have other trials in the area, but every variety sign that you see there is one of the varieties that appears in our own farm trial. So take a look at them, just get an idea on what the growth characteristics are, and you can look into them and see how well they're fruiting up and all that. So right now it looks like pretty good cotton. All right, so any questions for me before Dr. Edmondson talks? All right, well, thank you.